and the people of Oamaru.
I call Chris Ockenbold.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to commend this bill to the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, I understand the next call is a split call. The Honourable... It's not a split call. My apologies, Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure I will take all of that time, but maybe I will. Mr. Speaker, I rise to follow on from the comments from Phil Twyford, whose contribution I agree with. I was the local Member of Parliament way back when this part of New Zealand was in the Otago electorate, and I was approached by the council who wanted to have the proper status of the Forester Heights land resolved. I lost an election in 2005, and Jackie Dean was appointed, and elected, quite right, was elected, as I was, through the list process, and I became Minister of Lands. I was appointed as Minister of Lands, that's quite right, having been elected to Parliament. And at the time, the question as to the proper status of the Forester Heights land was contentious. It was in my political interest locally to actually back the people who said that this land was reserve status land rather than endowment land. But my duty as Minister of Lands was to inquire as to what the proper status of the land was. The Department of Conservation are the authority to whom the Land Information New Zealand go to for advice as to proper status of land, and the Department of Conservation concluded that the land was endowment land, not reserve land. I had been provided information by local constituents that suggested otherwise, and so I took that information back to the Department of Conservation and said, please check again. They then came back and they said that this was endowment land, not reserve land, and so it was included in the Reserves and Other Land Disposal Bill, which corrects errors of that kind. That legislation was not advanced for a number of years on the order paper by the incoming government after the 2008 election, and Jackie Dean then sought to bring this forward by way of local bill to have the matter settled in the local bill rather than through the Reserves and Other Lands Disposal Bill. By that time, still further information had been turned up, the most interesting piece of which was a photocopy of a record that was turned up by Barry Monks, which he obtained from the museum in Oamaru. And that appeared to show that the land was indeed reserve land rather than endowment land. And there was a little bit of suggestion of skullduggery around that, because when he went back to get further copies of the land, the document concerned, it had been cut out of the archives. And so you can imagine why, on that basis, there was some suspicion on the part of the people who believe most vehemently that this is reserve land rather than endowment land, that there was some sort of dirty trick underway to hide the fact that this land was truly reserve land. As a consequence, when this matter came to Select Committee, evidence was presented to Select Committee from very well-meaning people, including Barry Monks and Warren Crawford, amongst others, in Oamaru, who said that they were absolutely convinced that this was reserve land, not endowment land. Now, the job of the Select Committee wasn't to plan the future of that land if it was endowment land. The job of the Select Committee was to decide what its proper status was. Was it reserve land or was it endowment land? And tempting though it is to actually take the next step down and actually make the planning decision as to what should happen with the land, that's actually not the role of this Parliament in that regard. It's actually to find out what is the true status of that land. And accordingly, the Select Committee, again, the Labour Party members on that Select Committee, who included Annette King, were not motivated by a desire to find this to be endowment land. If anything, they were motivated by a desire to prove that this was reserve land. But the advice that they received in the end was that it is endowment land, not reserve land. And as a consequence, they quite properly said that their duty to this Parliament was to report back that upon inquiry they had concluded, on the balance of all of the evidence and the advice from officials, that it is endowment land. So that's the advice that this Parliament has received, that having gone into it so thoroughly, in the end, someone has to make a decision, and on the balance of the evidence, the Select Committee, ably chaired by Mr Okunvole, concluded that it's endowment land, and that's where it ends. That's what this bill says, it's endowment land. Then the question as to whether it should be developed is a different question for the Council under their legislation. That in turn has public processes. The long-term community plan includes the right of public participation to turn up and say this land should not be subdivided, and people have done that. And their elected representatives have said no, they disagree, they think it should be developed. I personally disagree with that. I actually don't think this land should be developed. I would prefer that Forester Height land to be undeveloped, but my opinion on that is irrelevant. These decisions are delegated to the local council, and if we start reversing that position and think all these decisions should be taken in Parliament, then we might as well not have local government. So, Mr Speaker, for those reasons, with sadness and with, I know I regret this, I have Warren Crawford, even just 2 weeks ago when I saw him when I was down in Oamaru talking about the terrible things that are happening with Summit Wool Spinners down there. He again said, look, disagree, and that's his right to disagree. And Barry Monks is still not convinced either. But the Select Committee was, and that's the basis upon which we, as a Parliament, have to make a decision, and the evidence is that this is endowment land, not reserve land, and that's why the Labor Party is supporting this bill.
I call Todd McClay.
Mr Speaker, thank you. From place call to the Waitaki